Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you all for joining me today. Today is Tuesday, July 2nd. Cruising on my way into my place of employment, and just wanted to do a little brief audio. Let's see here. So I know that I had to roast somebody yesterday, and I appreciate you guys bearing with me when I have to do those kinds of things, because sometimes you just have to, right? I mean, I hate to give these wannabes the attention. For instance, like Joel Sexton, Bobby Statzer, and now the latest Three Stooger, Joseph Simpson. I hate to give them the attention that they so desperately want and love and need. But sometimes you have to smack them around a little bit, and then you can return to regular scheduled programming. So that's, unfortunately what I'll have to do with Joe eventually when I have a little bit of time here to sit down and, produce a presentation. And I'm looking forward to it. I listened to his first 30-minute presentation last night, and it was absolutely pathetic. All he did was whine and complain about how he got smacked around in the IO groups, and it's clear that he's kind of like hurt, like he's very sensitive and hurt over it. So this is why he's doing what he's doing, right? There's no genuine motive here. It's just he doesn't like the people in IO, so he's going to try to kick up dirt because his name is Joe Dirt. So I will get around to that hopefully very soon. Like I said, probably next week is when I'm going to do it, and then I'll share it, and we'll basically be moving on from the latest wannabe. But anyways, today I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple things. The first thing I wanted to talk about that I don't think people think about enough is Peter's epistle, right? I mean, Peter writes this epistle, right? 1 Peter and 2 Peter. And he addresses it to the elect of the dispersion, right? Now, most people would agree, scholars and whatnot agree that the epistles of Peter were written probably closer to the end, right? Closer to the destruction, maybe within 10 years or so of that time, just as a ballpark estimate. And so you have Peter, right, long into the gospel mission, right? Now, if the timeline is correct, right, and if this story is, correct and true and all that, then Jesus would have been around sometime around maybe 30 is when the mission began. He commissioned them to go out to the ends of the land to gather in the lost sheep, the elect. And so that would have been around 80-30 or so. And then within a generation, which is roughly 40 years according to biblical standards, the temple would have fallen, Jerusalem would have been destroyed, not one stone would have been left unturned, the age would have been over. And so Peter, right, roughly 35 years after Christ, kind of comes on and writes this epistle, and he writes it to the saints, right, to the elect, just basic general addressing to the elect. And he calls them the elect of the dispersion, right? So obviously, we know Peter's writing to the dispersed Israelites, the elect. Now, if you know anything about the Old Testament and the term elect, that was only ever used for Israel, right? There's probably dozens upon dozens of examples of that, and maybe I'll do a presentation soon on that, showing that anytime the phrase the elect is used in this story, it's always Israel. It's never anybody else. So the elect in the New Testament is no different, obviously. Jesus said he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That is the elect. And so, Peter opens up and addresses his letter to the elect of the dispersion. Now, you have to kind of think, right? You have to think logically here. In what world does it make any sense for Peter to only write a letter addressing it to the elect of the dispersion, right? Why wouldn't Peter address his letter to the pagans, right? To the pagan believers, to the Gentile believers? He doesn't, right? Peter, almost towards the end of the age, right, after the gospel mission had already gone out to all the world, according to Paul, is writing a letter, but he's only addressing it to the elect of the dispersion. He's not addressing it to any Gentiles, to any foreigners, nothing, right? So what is that all about, right? Was Peter just so, hostile towards these outsiders that he only wrote his epistles to the elect of the dispersion in these regions, right? Because remember now, he's writing to nations, right? Galatia, Pontus, Asia, Cappadocia, Bithynia, right? So he's writing to all these nations, and he addresses his letter to the elect of the dispersion in those nations. Now, that seems kind of harsh, right? If he's just cutting out all the Gentile believers, right? If he's just writing to the dispersed Israelites in those regions and saying, the hell with all you other, Gentile believers in those regions, right? Think about that. Why would he leave those people out of the addressing of his letter? Well, the reason is because this was a mission to seek the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that's all it was. And when we look at his second epistle, as he's writing to the same people, he says, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 and forward, he makes the statement that, his beloved brother Paul also wrote to them in all of his epistles, speaking in them of these things. So in other words, Peter's writing to the dispersed Israelites in the nations. He's telling them that Paul also wrote to them in all of his epistles about the same things. So you can see how Paul's letters also went to the elect of the dispersion in the nations, right? And that's apparent, obviously. I mean, we got 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, where Paul flat out says, all of our fathers passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses. He's making no distinction between Gentiles and Jews there, right? He's just making a generalized statement that all of the elect saints' fathers passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses. We see him tell the Galatians that if they are Christ, it's because they're Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise. Now remember, when you look at the beginning of the story in Genesis, when God makes the promise to Abraham, we see that he promises Abraham a few things, but one of the things that he promises about his seed is that they would become like the stars of heaven in number, right? They'd blossom and bloom into this great multitude, right? And what do you see in the Old Testament? So you have this in the beginning, right, with Abraham, that promise is made that his seed, Abraham's seed, would become like the stars of heaven in number. Now, most Christians, wannabes, would think that that is them today, right? That's Christians from all nations having become a great multitude as the stars of heaven in number. But that's totally false, because that promise to become like the stars of heaven in number was already fulfilled just centuries after Abraham lived. Right, we see Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. He says, standing before the Israelites, he says, you are too great for me to bear. Here you are today, having become like the stars of heaven in number. So that's the fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham about his seed, that they would become like the stars of heaven in number. And guess what? Israel fulfilled that. Israel was Abraham's seed, and Israel blossomed and bloomed like the stars of heaven in number. So you can see how the promise to Abraham's seed that they would become like the stars of heaven in number was only relative to Old Covenant Israel. Likewise, the promise that Abraham's seed would be blessed, same thing, Old Covenant Israel. Abraham's seed, that term never changes, okay? And so when you get to Galatians and Paul says, if you are Christ's, it's because you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise. You have to understand that they were heirs, right? The heirs according to promise, the promise was made to Israel. That whole batch of promises that God made about Abraham's seed was related and pertinent only to Old Covenant Israel. And so when you get to the New Testament, you see Abraham's seed being gathered in from all places where they were because they were heirs, right? They were heirs. And this all stems back, of course, to what Moses said in Deuteronomy 4:27 and forward, where he promised that in the latter days, the children of Israel would be scattered in the nations, paganized, worshiping the work of men's hands, wood and stone. But God would remember the covenant promise that he made with their fathers, right? Because they're heirs, of course. And he would have mercy upon them, and he would turn and have mercy upon them. That's what this is all about. That's the exact fulfillment of what Moses predicted, what we see going on in the New Testament letters before the coming of the Lord to gather his saints. And so, yeah, the Peter thing, though, I don't think people use that enough, right? I mean, this is powerful stuff. Peter, who should have been, a loving, caring Christian, accepting of all people, was only writing to the elect of the dispersion. Peter did not address his letter to a single solitary person outside of the dispersed Israelites. And likewise, Peter says that Paul's letters were also written to the same people. So that's a dagger, right? I mean, an absolute bomb, right? And people just kind of ignore it. Same thing with James. James wrote to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. Now, I've heard some wackadoodle explanations about why that is, but if you think about it, those aren't the Jews, right? James is not writing to Jews. James is writing to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. Greetings, my brethren. So you can see who the brethren in the story are. They're the 12 tribes scattered abroad. All right, and there was no, ifs, ands, or buts about that. You can't take things that the letter of James is speaking of and apply them to yourself today. That's stupid. That's asinine, because the letter wasn't written to you. Okay, the letter was written to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, and just so happens, John in the book of Revelation said that the 12 tribes scattered abroad were the only ones getting the Holy Spirit. He said that the 12 tribes were the only ones who could learn the redemption song. He said that the 12 tribes were the only ones with their names written on the city, and a host of other things, right? So the 12 tribes is really the only people in focus here, hence why Jesus said he comes only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that constituted sheep in the Jewish fold and sheep in the Gentile fold. They were everywhere, near and far. The promise was to Israel near, their children, and to all of those who were afar off, as many as their Lord will call, said Peter. So I just wanted to kind of go over that really quick to get you thinking in that direction again. And, when somebody tries to argue, just ask them about the letter of Peter, right? Peter's writing to the nations, totally leaving out any foreigners, right? Not even mentioning them in his letter. And this epistle is chock full of gospel, right? It's chock full of the blood of Christ. It's chock full of his coming for them. It's chock full of all these redemptive elements and gospel-focused elements. And yet, Peter doesn't write to a single person beyond the dispersed Israelites. Right? Now, you have to dance like Michael Jackson to get around from that. And some people try, and it's pretty pathetic. But, so I wanted to kind of go over that really quick. Now, the other thing I wanted to go over was Revelation chapter 3, to the faithful church in Philadelphia, what John says here. All right, he says in Revelation 3, verse 7, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. For you have a little strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you, because you have kept my command to persevere. I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the new city, New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write on him my new name." So if you look at the things that are being said there, he's talking about writing the new name on him, right? And the new name of the city and everything. And when we get a little further on in this book, we see whose name is written on the city, right? It's the 12 tribes, nobody else, right? I mean, that's pretty powerful, right? Here's John writing to saints in Philadelphia, right? This is a supposedly foreign church, a foreign group of a foreign body of saints. And he's writing to them and telling them that he would write their names on the new city. But when you get to the new city later on in the book and you see whose names are being written on that new city, it's only the 12 tribes of Israel. Revelation chapter 21, I believe it is. So if John's writing to these ones in Philadelphia and he's telling them that he would that God would write their names on the new city, and if later on when we get to Revelation 21, we see whose names are written on the city, and it's only the 12 tribes, then who's John writing to in Philadelphia? He's writing to the elect of the dispersion, right? And obviously no one would dare argue that the other 6 churches of Asia contained anyone other than that, right? Because as you're looking at all these things that John is saying to these elect ones in these regions and in these areas, he's telling them that they'd be clothed in white, they'd be washed, their garments wouldn't be defiled, they would overcome and be in the New Jerusalem and everything. And then when you get to the end of the story, you see who's clothed in white, right? Look at Revelation 14. We see the ones clothed in white, undefiled, they're like virgins, and it's the 144K. It's the 12 tribes, right? And it says no one except the 12 tribes could learn the redemption song, and no one but them was singing and rejoicing that song. So, yeah, it's pretty clear, right? I mean, every single letter that's being written to every single region in these nations is literally being written to the 12 tribes of Israel. And it just makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, it really, what this view does, this Israel-only view, it really keeps things nice and tight, right? It keeps things in order. Things line up nicely. You can take Jesus' statement in Matthew 15:24 for what it says, right? I mean, because there's no two ways to interpret what Jesus said there, right? People try their hardest, right? If you have to try to explain something so difficult, right, like that, and try to explain it away and make it kind of blend and jive with a universal salvation message so hard, right? Because people let's face it, they've done anything they can to try to do away with that passage and do away with those words, and like the words in Matthew 10, don't go here, but rather only go here. If you have to work so hard to do away with that, then chances are you're not being honest, right? And you should just let it say what it says. Because Jesus said he only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So let's say that I get to heaven, right, when I die, and I walk up to the pearly gates, and I say to God, God says to me, how come you were so against my Bible story, right? And I say to him, well, God, I read your Bible story, and I saw what Jesus said, and he said he only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And instantly God has no comeback, right? Because that's just, it's just an ironclad statement, right? I mean, how do you interpret that any other way? I'm just being honest. That's all I'm doing, right? Is God going to punish me for being honest? I mean, Jesus said he only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And I'm taking it for what it says, and I'm listening, and I'm agreeing with it. Because as I've discovered, everything else that the New Testament actually says, when you understand it in light of what's really going on, actually matches what he said. And that's the coolest thing, is to see, wow, he said it. We've tried to deny it and get around it for so long. We couldn't, because obviously it's a bold, clear statement. But now that we've seen, oh, wow, okay, there were Israelites living as Gentiles, right? These are the ones in the nations. These are the dispersion among the Gentiles that Jesus was going to teach, right? These are the ones afar off that Paul said Christ had broken down the enmity with and brought back. These are the prodigal sons that have been rolling around with the filth in the nations and have been brought back to the Father, right? It just makes perfect sense. And so the goal that Paul says, the sum of all parts, was all Israel saved. And that included the fullness of the ones in the nations, right? And that obviously doesn't imply a spiritual Israel concept, which is dumb, right? Now, there was a true Israel of God within Israel, yes. Not all Israel was Israel, but it still didn't extend beyond the totality of Israel. It was a remnant within. So, yeah, just some things to really think about there, and it's kind of cool to actually allow Jesus' statement to actually kind of mold and anchor the understanding in the New Testament, because that's really what it's all about. It was all about Israel. Even Paul's goal, the sum of all Paul's parts, was all Israel saved. So, and then, one last thing to munch on this morning before I let you go. I was talking to a buddy before, and I said, doesn't it just kind of make sense, right? I mean, we're full preterists, right? We understand the time statements. We understand that if Jesus didn't come back when he said he was, then the whole story's horseshit anyway, which, it's probably myth anyway. I've been saying this. I've been very open and transparent about my journey in that regard. Like, I started out as Israel only, thinking it's Israel only, but the story's true. I didn't even believe in a rapture at the beginning, and then I started seeing how clear the rapture is, and how if you believe in the ascension of Jesus, then you are bound to believe in the ascension of the saints at his coming, because that's exactly what they were promised. But then I kind of moved into the rapture, and as I started seeing, well, this is exactly what the story says. These people ascended up into the clouds to be with the dead ones, just like Christ did. And so I said, it's probably a little beyond the realm of believability. And, people kind of laugh at the rapture, right? But all the while, they hold true to all the supernatural stuff that they see in the Gospels, right? The raising of the dead, the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, the turning water into wine, like all these things, no problem, right? This is totally within the realm of possibility, right? But when it comes to the rest of the angelic brethren being changed into immortal angelic beings and ascending up into the clouds just like Christ did, oh, no. Now that's where we draw the line. No, it doesn't work like that. If you're going to believe in the supernatural, you have to take it all the way. Okay, you have to cap the story off for what it says, and that is the final ride off into the sunset where the saints are taken into their age to come, that the 12 tribes serve God earnestly day and night, hoping to attain, like Paul said. But as I was saying, I mean, the story is probably untrue as it is, but, you know, the logic behind my argument is pretty sound, I would say, right? I mean, Jesus was coming for what reason? The Bible says he was coming for his saints. Okay, he would descend with the voice of the archangel and the voice of the loud trumpet, and he would call up the dead, and the living would be changed. They'd be caught up together in the clouds where they would forever be with the Lord, right? They would put on immortal, angelic, glorified bodies. But the key there is, what was he coming for? He was coming for his saints. Okay? Now, to suggest that that extends beyond the coming, to suggest that there are saints beyond the coming, makes no sense and just kind of leaves it out there dangling with nothing anchoring it, right? I mean, that's just your opinion. That's just a guess. There is nothing in the Bible to back that up. Jesus was coming for his saints, to gather his saints to himself, to take them to the place that he went to prepare for them. And that is exactly what this story is saying. Okay, nothing beyond that. There is nothing beyond the coming of the Lord. The final picture after the coming of the Lord for his saints is the full body, the 144K, the 12 tribes of Israel, all Israel saved, standing in heaven, redeemed by the throne, crying out with palm branches, saying salvation belongs to our God, singing the redemption song with the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders, washed, clothed in white, their names written on the new city, safe, no threat of enemy attacks. The gates never shut because there would be no night there. There was literally no threat, no danger, and they would forever be with their God. That's the whole story, folks. That's it in a nutshell. Okay? If you want to try to extend that beyond that and plunge yourself back into the story after the coming for his saints, then you go right ahead. But the rest of us will be over here basking in the sunshine and enjoying the refreshing waters of clarity. Okay? So that's pretty much all I got for you this morning, folks. I hope you all have a lovely day. This may be my last one for the week, seeing as how the 4th of July festivities will be kicking off here shortly. Yeah, that's pretty much it. We'll be back another day, another time, another place, another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.